Hello, and welcome back to Hannah Wonders, the pod where I, Hannah, wonder about all things theater. Thank you so much for joining me, and for those of you who are new to my pod, thanks for being here. In starting this pod, I knew that my goal was to get the attention of people who may not be traditional theater goers, and this episode is no exception. This week, I've researched all things Evil Dead the Musical. Just like with Spider-Man the musical, the exciting thing about this show is I didn't know much about it. I've been a die-hard Evil Dead and Army of Darkness fan since I was in high school. And all I had really heard about the musical is that it was super fun, really gory, and true to the humor of Army of Darkness, which is of course my favorite part. This all had my head ringing because it goes against something I have been very adamant about. Movies do not need to be turned into musicals. While I definitely still feel that way, I've come to terms with an exception to this rule. Cult movies. Think about it. Do I want Frozen, Pretty Woman, or School of Rock to hit Broadway? Hell no! And my usual reasoning for this is musical theater creatives think of using well-known material just to profit. But that, together with the fact that a lot of movies turned into Broadway shows don't cross mediums with any sense of creativity, I just have become a super jaded theater lover, especially when you look at what is up on Broadway right now. Then I had to stop and think. But wait, I love Heathers, Toxic Avenger, and American Psycho. Why are these shows different? I've decided it's because all of these shows took a film and in some way or another took complete creative license and reshaped the production. Whether it's the ending, the plot entirely, or just the way it's scenically designed, these shows have taken the original content and turned it into something of its own. Toxic Avenger, for instance, is one of my favorite musicals ever. Based on a film from 1984 by the same name, the original film was partial superhero, partial environmental protection advocacy. The film features a protagonist with the best name, Melvin Ferd III, who falls into a toxic waste drum in his hometown of Tromaville, New Jersey. When this show was selected and changed for the stage, the writers stripped away the additional plot lines and focused on a now female version of the antagonist mayor. They also enhanced the romance between the deformed hero and his crush, ready for it, a blind librarian. You can see why this is one of my favorites. The show writers took the film's framework and crafted something new from it. That is like the basic of all of this, right? This is why I get so upset when it's just like, oh, okay, so we're going to take Pretty Woman and put some really famous actors in there, which don't get me wrong, I'm super excited to see Orphe in that show and see like what she does on the cast recording. But it's not new. It's not fresh. So give me a Toxic Avenger where they're going to strip it down to what the basics were and completely revamp it. American Psycho is the same way. While it still stars our lead Patrick Bateman as he goes through his psychotic break, instead of going in depth with scenery and rich landscapes in New York, which would have been really easy to do when they remounted it, instead, we get a technologically thrilling set design. With simplistic modern elements to the costuming and set, we're left with a fresh new take on the thriller that still gives homage to its original creation. What I'm saying is that musicals with a cult following instead of a mainstream audience seem to have more creative freedom and room to play with the original material of the show. To me, anything that crosses genres should do that. Don't cover a song and just sing it the same way. Cover it and try and make it different and better than the original. Make it your own. Evil Dead is one of the biggest cult classics of all time. Technically, all a cult classic is a show or a movie that didn't do well in the box office originally, and after a period of time becomes well known due to word of mouth. having post-show sales of recordings and video far excelling the box office pull that it had. One of the reasons this show in particular is so interesting to me is because of the franchise itself and how it came to be. So obviously I'm going to tell you about it because that's why we're here. When I think of the original installments of the franchise, I really think of Evil Dead 1, 2, and Army of Darkness. I'm aware that there is the TV show, Ash versus the Evil Dead. I am not myself a huge horror buff. The reason that I like Evil Dead 1 is because I appreciated the second one first, actually. So while the TV version is a whole other unique genre to itself, I'm really going to just focus on the original film franchise because the musical came immediately after that. So the musical actually was the predecessor to the TV show. But Evil Dead, like I said, is a horror film directed by the amazing Sam Raimi and is very, very loosely based on his first short film, Within the Woods. Within the Woods was it was basically a bunch of students that got together, or not really students, they were just young adults that got together and they wanted to prove that they were worth investing in. So they created this show called Within the Woods. It kind of had like a Blair Witch Project vibe to it, just to show a producer, hey, invest in us, this is what we can do. And they really set out to make a great horror movie. So the original film of Evil Dead premiered in 1981 and had a budget of only $350,000. But the show brought in $2.4 million in the box office. Not great, not terrible. I mean, it was a low budget film, so kind of what to be expected. But the movie starred my ultimate heartthrob, Bruce Campbell, now and forever. And he was completely unknown at that time. But like the basic plot is a bunch of high school kids go to a cabin in the woods. Some of them get possessed and try to kill others, so they all fight and kill each other. There's this super messed up scene where a character gets sexually assaulted by a tree. Yes, a tree. And Bruce Campbell played the more well-known character of the film. His name is Ash. And he's sort of the protagonist. But at the end of Evil Dead, it does kind of end on a bit of a downer, which I didn't expect after watching Evil Dead 2 beforehand, just because it had such a different vibe. The reason the film did so well and never got and even had an opportunity to do a sequel is because of a very special horror legend who raved about how amazing it was. The horror legend? Stephen King himself. Yeah, Stephen King called it the most ferociously original horror film of the year. I mean, honestly, they refer to this a lot, this incident of him reviewing the movie as the only reason that the franchise exists. So I think that's really cool. Shout out to Stephen King for boosting that up. But the filming process for this film was a complete nightmare. Ended up taking twice as much time to film as they had originally slated and budgeted for. And so by the end of it, Sam Raimi had crew members, cast members that were like, hey, I've got another job, I gotta go. And it was miserable to work. I mean, imagine being in freezing temperatures in the middle of the woods, working covered in Caro syrup, which if you haven't worked with it before, it's corn syrup essentially. And it's sticky and it's gross. Like there's these amazing shots of Raimi with his camera and it's covered in fake blood because he's running back and forth setting stuff and then going back to the camera. And all of this was because he lost most of his cast and crew. So by the end of filming, it was just a couple of his friends that he had called in a panic to come help out. And then, of course, Bruce Campbell, who would never give up. But Bruce even talks about how absolutely miserable that was. Luckily for Evil Dead 2, they had learned a little bit by then. So in 1987, Raimi put out the second film in the franchise and, of course, kept Bruce Campbell as Ash. And the second film is interesting because it wasn't so much as a sequel or a remake, but something in the middle. So since the first Evil Dead was considered a true horror film, Evil Dead 2 was a horror comedy. And Campbell had always done comedy in his past. It totally shows in this film. He's just such a ham. Like, oh my God, I'm so in love with him. But I mean, I'll never forget when a friend of mine in high school introduced me to this show, and he was a huge fan of the original Evil Dead. That's where he got his like kind of one of his bugs to do theater. And he paused on the first scene in the cabin. And he told me that because of the budget restrictions, all of the interior shots of the cabin scene were done inside of a high school gym in North Carolina. And it's one of those things where, for some reason, it seems like when you have a budget restrictions and staffing restrictions, there's some sort of nuanced creativity that comes out of that. It almost pushes the creatives to think even harder, even deeper, and more intensely about the way that they're going about shooting. And it worked out for them. I mean, it was really fantastic. And while the film had a bigger budget, it just still wasn't big enough to have a soundstage built. So they just worked with what they had. While the second film wasn't nearly as complicated to produce as the first, there were some very serious costume issues, specifically with Sam Raimi's brother, Ted. He was an extra in the first film, and then in this one, he plays one of the lead characters and essentially becomes this demon-possessed woman, which is great and hilarious. But there's stories from Gregory Nicotero, who was the special effects artist on the production, that when Ted would hand him his mask, he would have to drain the sweat out by tilting it towards the ear. And there was so much sweat, it would like fill several Dixie cups. Like, so nasty. But Ted was often overheated, like dangerously overheated, because the costume was made out of full body latex. The film did do better in the box office than its predecessor. Ended up bringing in $6 million. So it was a nice little reprieve after what they had gone through with the first movie, to be able to see this come to fruition in a more successful way. All right, so for any true Evil Dead fans out there, I know this makes me a super basic chick, but my favorite movie in the series is definitely the 1992 Army of Darkness. When I was in college, I had an oversized poster, like, of the movie poster above my bed. Even the poster was super cool. They pulled on all the old oil painting looking movie posters from the 1940s, where it definitely, it looked like an oil painting, but like with a film noir edge almost. And I loved it. I thought it was great. Not to mention it depicts Bruce Campbell shirtless, so that's always a win for me. So Army of Darkness picks up after Evil Dead 2. So Ash has been hurled back in time to 1300 AD. And the only things that come through the portal with him are his Oldsmobile and what he calls his boomstick, which is a double-barrel shotgun. Super quick version of the plot. Ash wants to go back to his timeline. He messes up trying to do that, unlocks a ton of undead, and has to save that world before he can move on to going back to his time. The fun thing with this film is how many endings there are, and Sam Raimi isn't upset about that either. Universal Studios didn't enjoy the original ending, so there were alternate ones created and released at different times. I believe we're up to 6 different endings, depending on the country, like which country it was copied in, which I just find super fascinating. But the film got the series a lot of attention. This one in particular appealed to a much wider audience. And I will just never get over Bruce Campbell in that movie. I mean, he was at his prime. Every line in there is a freaking gem. Hail to the king, baby. Yes, I will. Thank you. Seriously, I could talk forever about this movie, but I know you're here for theater, so reining it in. Evil Dead, the musical. The musical was created by a bunch of young Canadians, and it started in the back of a bar in Toronto in 2003. The show was super small, but had people lining up around the block to see it. So when it started getting super popular, there were offers in other cities to travel the show around. It opened in November 2006 in New York City at New World Stages, an off-Broadway playhouse. And by this time, it was endorsed by both Raimi and Campbell. I think I loosely remember when this all happened, but I didn't have any clue that the cast album for this show hit number 4 on the Billboard show charts. And that's so rad for the cult following it had. I mean, think about it. This is okay, so like 2006, like YouTube, you still had to like buffer videos 4 seconds at a time to watch them. So if people are sharing the soundtrack, it was a slow process. Downloading that stuff on LimeWire, people were spending hours trying to get copyrighted Evil Dead the musical soundtracks. I can only imagine getting that letter from your internet company, like, oh, you're being fined because you downloaded a really obscure cult classic musical soundtrack. Like, super embarrassing. Anyway, by the way, I didn't do that, but that's because I wasn't cool enough to know about this at the time. The genius behind this musical phenomenon consisted of book and lyric writer George Reinblatt, with music by Frank Kippola, Christopher Bond, and Melissa Morris. This team had comedians, first-time writers, and an award-winning composer. The show itself is a beautiful blend of the first two Evil Dead films, with iconic lines from Army of Darkness. The general plot features the 5 college students going to an abandoned cabin in the woods where they unleash an evil force that turns them into demons. It still has Ash as the protagonist, but the feature of this production is its superfluous, oh yeah, I used a fancy word, superfluous use of blood and gore. As an audience member, you have the option to sit in the fondly referred to splash zone, a set of seats where patrons are guaranteed to be completely covered in fake blood throughout the show, and especially during the finale. There are photos where they're just spraying, just hosing down the splash zone. It's so gross and amazing. Something so unique to this production is the intense special effects knowledge and use required by not just the crew, but the actors as well. The original Ash from the first US tour, his name is David, and I cannot say his last name. It's like Sajewicz? David S. Let's call him David S. Mentioned in an interview that for the first month on tour, we were still perfecting the blood, so it would come out at different pressures every night. There were times that month when the blood would get in my eye, which stings really bad, or shoot down the back of my throat, which was the wrong way it was intended to go. Overall, this production is such a mess. Like the cleanup crews, when they first started the tour, it would take them between, I think they said 4 to 6 hours to clean the theater entirely. They did get that time down after practice, but just to give, I really want you to understand how much blood really is used in this production. This whole research project was really difficult, which is part of the reason this pod is coming out late, because I really wanted to give you all some information about the way that blood was used and how they did the blood effects specifically in this production. So I was trying to find some info on that, and it was little to none. And there's a reason for that I'll tell you in a minute. But there was a company called Bleeding Art Industries, and they staged the show in Calgary. And their special effects veteran said that the amount of blood used in the show is completely based on budget. So depending on the venue, what the producers have given them to work on, that will determine how much blood they have access to. But generally, they're working with drums of blood, holding between 15 to 45 gallons of fake blood a night. Gallons. Like, this is not for the faint of heart at all, not even to work on the show. These drums are then pressurized to get the right spray. So depending on the effect, like for instance, I was referring to the finale when the audience gets hosed down, the drums themselves have to be pressurized and then run through a tube to make that happen. And this seems to be the biggest challenge of the whole show, because you're attempting to get the blood to spray at the same pressure, hitting the same mark night after night. And it's just ridiculous how complex this is with how many variables there are to work with. When on tour, companies like this will spend an entire day on set testing just the pressure with the water to make sure that they don't waste too much like actual prop blood. So it's an entire day of just pressurizing the drums, then having the actors, do their thing. And it's essentially just like a really gross tech run. It gives a whole different meaning to the term wet tech, actually. Never thought about that. If I had a little drum kit, I'd do a little didn't. Anyway, I'm hilarious. I think I'm hilarious. I wish I could hear laughter so I knew if I was funny. I need that validation. Anyway, um, so for Bleeding Art Industries, the group that did it in Calgary, they decided to use a blood that's referred to as a stable, non-staining blood concoction made from industrial food dye powder. I personally have no idea what that means, but I've noticed throughout the research that there are thousands of ways to make fake blood. So here's a little more info on that for you. I decided, because I was running into a wall with the research, that I wanted to go to a friend of mine who is an incredible prop master at a professional theater company. And she took the time to chat with me about what's required for a show like Evil Dead. She hasn't worked on Evil Dead specifically, but she referred to, Julius Caesar, when you're doing Macbeth, a lot of shows that require a more classic blood approach. And by classic, I guess I mean more realistic. Yeah, going for something more authentic. So she was a great person to chat with about this. And when I mentioned my struggles in the research process, she told me that this is because special effects designers with a great blood recipe will keep it super close to the chest because it makes them a super valuable asset to a production. She said super so many times. Super. But she would want me to preface all of this that a show of this caliber would have its own designated special effect designer, totally separate from props. The theater may even need to acquire specific licenses to produce the show, depending on what kind of blood contraptions are being used. I asked her if she was handed a script like Evil Dead, where would you even start? Like, where does your mind go when you're determining what how you're going to craft this? The first thing out of her mouth, where is the blood going? According to my favorite prop guru, she says that there are millions of recipes for stage blood. Well, that was my word, millions, because you know how I do. And all of these different recipes have different purposes and pros and cons to working with them. So the first thing she thinks about is if the blood is being eaten or is going onto an actor's skin. If so, then the base of the blood needs to be a safe consumable. One of a classic version to use is peanut butter as a base. However, at a professional theater level, there's too much risk with nut allergies that it's not only possibly unsafe for the actors, where you would check, of course, before you used it, but you never know who's in the audience that may have an allergic reaction. So even though that one works really well, it's not as common in larger theater settings. So she also rattled off a variety of other options, which I thought was crazy, is a pudding base. She also said that she had worked with a blood base of vodka, which starts as a great runny spray because of the consistency, but then it actively coagulates on stage. Disgusting. I could never do this line of work. I can't even imagine having to do this research. Like, talking to her, she knew, okay, well, if you're looking at an arterial blood spray, then you're really working with this kind of viscosity. Or, if it's like a corpse that is recently dead. Oh my God, it's so crazy how many details there are on this. And like a lot of this stuff is self-taught too. I mean, of course you can take classes on it and certifications, but many prop people learn as they go through the industry on how to mix different kinds of blood. And it's so gross. You can't, like, doing a show that requires this much thought about bodily fluids is just so nasty to me. But this is why I don't do that job. This is why I sit behind my very safe microphone and just tell people what I like to think about behind my computer. It's much less messy. But I would say that her second thought when she's looking at a show like this is cleanup. If blood is being sprayed onto clothing, walls, etc., it's better to use a soap or glycerin base, as it doesn't stain, and because that's what you would use to clean clothes. When you put it into the wash, it actually does keep the stains lifted, so it's a lot easier to get out. It's important to remember that the more costume like duplicates you have, the more money a show is going to cost, right? So say you have Ash, he's performing a matinee and he's performing an evening show. So it would make sense for that company to probably have 2 sets of his costumes and maybe a spare for emergencies. But they're still washing those 2 sets of clothes like before the next day. So it needs to be something that's fairly easy to remove, because the poor costume people, I mean, they are the ones that have to sit there and scrub it out, because there's nothing worse than like the actor walking on stage in a white t-shirt and you can just see the remnant blood stains. The fun part is seeing it for the first time. And it can already take between 4 to 6 hours to do laundry for a show like this. And that's only with like 5 to 7 characters. So you can imagine how that grows exponentially. You are not going to find a theater company that is going to just purchase a new set of clothes for each time, which is essentially what you would have to do if you use like Caro syrup or something that has like a stickier base. Water doesn't work because not only does it stain, because the water draws the food dye into the fabric, but it's also super runny. So you're not going to you're going to get much more of a pink pigmentation than an actual blood red. Now, when I went into this research, all I really knew about were squibs, and squibs are generally small packs of blood that are pierced or exploded on film or stage. So these are used for various reasons, usually in knife fights, bullet wounds, etc. But now exploding squibs are an example of a special effect that requires a permit and an amazing special effects designer on hand, because they're incredibly dangerous. They literally have a small fuse and explode, and it creates a really cool effect on stage. It's mostly used in film, especially for bullet wounds. That's where you're going to get that back spray from it. But it's a really dangerous process. You can burn the actor, and if something goes wrong, you can seriously injure or possibly kill one. So I don't mean to say you can kill one of those. Don't kill your actors. So yeah, I just found it really interesting how, I mean, I remember doing college films where they talked about using exploding squibs, and looking back on it, I can't believe that nobody died. And in a theater setting, it's more likely to use squibs that are popped by the actor themselves or their scene partner. And this technique is just like with the pressure drums and tubing used for big sprays. It requires a lot of practice. Depending on how much blood you want to come out, how fast, it's going to change the consistency and all of that. So squibs can take many forms. I would say that the most frequently used that I've seen is where there's usually a squib attached to an actor or like tightly placed against their skin, and like a scene partner will run up and pop it with their hand. If there's a lot of action on stage, you need to make sure that the squib is secure enough to where it's not going to pop when you don't want it to. There are some stories of people wearing rings with like a small pin on the inside, so when they run up, they can pop that without injuring the actor. But it really depends on what you're looking for. My wonderful prop friend also mentioned that condoms are used. Oh my God, I just wish that theater was sponsored by like Trojan, because you have no idea how many things we use condoms for. A non-lubricated condom is used in sound design for mic packs to protect mic packs from sweat. And in this case with squibs, you can drop it in there, tie it off. And then in order to make it so that when you go to pop it, the condom doesn't stretch, because obviously they're made to stretch, a props master or special effects designer will wrap that in duct tape. So it creates tension on the pack. So it's easier to pop. But it's there's so many ways to think, okay, so this is what the scene is at its core. So-and-so stabs so-and-so, and then character over here is going to run over and like grab them as they die. So the character running over is probably going to be the one that pops that squib. But there's so many options, and it really just depends on what's available to you. The crazy thing with this show is how intriguing this was to special effects designers in general. And there's actually a very famous company who creates professional squibs who was asked to create a rig for Evil Dead, and they had to recreate, well, not recreate, they had to create a brand new contraption, specifically for the scene where Ash's hand gets ripped off. I can't even begin to explain the mechanics behind it, but essentially the way that it's tucked into his arm and his sleeve and the way that the contraption turns on was all new and unique. So that was part of, like, is the pressure perfect? Is the consistency perfect? Is it going to plug up the hose? All of these different things they had to think about. And so this company made a specific rig just for this production. I have no idea how many other companies have used the specific contraption that was created, but I would use it. It sounds fantastic. I've seen videos of the spray and it is disgusting. Speaking as somebody who is not a fan of gore, it is pretty gross. But yeah, there's so much to think about that, like, my head is kind of spinning. And I have so much more respect after doing the research on Evil Dead of, like, how these special effects worked. Even all the way back to the film. I mean, in Army of Darkness, they were mixing CGI claymation with live action, and the effect is, well, now it looks dated and hilarious, but you think about the budget for the film and it's fantastic. So yeah, I mean, I don't know, there's just so much in this show. There's quick change zombie makeup, which God only knows how a special effects person figured out how to do that. There's a scene where a chick stabs Ash in the ankle with a pencil and it, like, sticks out for a while. So you're thinking, like, so what is on his ankle that's holding the pencil? Is it retractable? Is it just half of the pencil and you don't see the full thing? So when it stabs in, it looks like the whole thing's in there. Again, millions of different ways to do these things, and every theater company and every designer sees it differently. But basically this whole pod just made me really want to rewatch all of Evil Dead and Army of Darkness. So I definitely know what I'm doing for the rest of the night. Oh, and as a final note, before I go, if you're going to use fake blood in the future, please stay away from Caro syrup. Your clothes, your skin, and your set will thank you, I promise, especially whoever is in charge of cleaning those things. So yeah, thank you guys so much for joining me on another crazy episode of Hanna Wonders. If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit rate and subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or YouTube, or all of the above if you're so inclined. I would super appreciate it. I'm still in the growing phases, so please share with your friends and family if you enjoy what I'm doing here. And yeah, good, bad, I'm the chick with the pod.